Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on the NAEd Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. Hopefully you can both hear me and see my slide. We are going to go ahead and begin the webinar now. So as I mentioned, this is the webinar on the NAEd Spencer Postdoc Fellowship Program. If you are interested in our dissertation fellowship, we hosted a webinar on that program already last week, and we'll be posting the recording of that here in about a week. So if you are a dissertation applicant, please note that this webinar will not be relevant to you. And if you're a postdoc applicant, welcome. We are glad that you're here today. So during our webinar, we will first talk about technical remarks, and then we'll dive into more information on the fellowship, talk about the online application and writing for your audience and other advice from a selection committee member. And then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So just some brief technical remarks. We will be responding to your questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to go ahead and enter them into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. The Q&A box is also where you'll put any comments about if you need tech assistance, if for any reason you can't see the PowerPoint or if you can't hear audio, please chat with us through the Q&A box. We will also be recording this webinar and sharing it sometime within the next week in case you'd like to go back to it for reference, or if you'd like to share it with any of your colleagues. Today's presenters are myself, Maria Gann, as well as my colleague at the National Academy of Education, Angie Harmon. The NAEd administers the postdoc fellowship on behalf of the Spencer Foundation, which is the sponsor and funder of the fellowship. We're also very glad to be joined today by David Figlio, who's the chair of the Postdoctoral Fellowship Selection Committee, as well as the Dean of the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. The fellowship is intended to buy out your time for the equivalent of one academic year in order to give you leave from both teaching and administrative duties to focus on your research project. When I hand it over to my colleague Angie, she'll be talking a bit more about the details of that arrangement, but just keep in mind this is the general goal of the fellowship program. I also wanted to make a few remarks about COVID-19 and its impact on the fellowship. Obviously, work has been stalled and delayed because of COVID, but please note we're moving forward with our application and selection process as normal. We will work with fellows in order to ensure that they're able to carry out their work despite COVID. So if you're chosen as a fellow and you need to adjust your research plan because of the pandemic, we will certainly work with you and make sure you're still able to take the leave and to focus on your research. One adjustment to this year's selection process was made just recently, a couple of weeks ago, where we extended the eligibility window by 1 year for this application cycle only. We do plan to return to the normal eligibility window next year, but the intention of this change was to give applicants whose work was delayed by COVID the opportunity to apply again this year. And again, Angie will speak more about this when she talks about eligibility. So I am going to go ahead and hand it over to my colleague, Angie Harmon, who will talk more about the online application.
Hi, thank you, Maria. So I'm going to go over the online application, which includes several components. We have the online application form, a project abstract, project description, a career statement, and then your reference letters. The last three components of the application are those that take the most time and that we receive the most questions about. So I'll describe them in more detail. The project description is extremely important. This is where you're going to describe your research project, including the goals of the project, its contribution to the field, the significance of the work, especially as it relates to education. The project description can be no more than 10 pages double-spaced. This is not a lot of space for all that you need to explain, so the description will likely be the application component that you spend the most time working on. Because the reviewers who will be reading your application come from a variety of disciplines, including your own, it is important to write the project description so that a broad audience could both understand the content and appreciate the importance of the project's potential impact. In the career statement, postdoctoral applicants should explain what led them to their current role as well as their interest in this particular project. And then for the letters of reference, you'll need 3. There are no requirements in terms of who you choose, but we always recommend that you choose people who know you and your work well. Next. This is a screenshot of the fellowship application portal. The easiest way to get here is by visiting our website, www.naeducation.org, and following the links from the Postdoctoral Fellowship page. Depending on what browser you're using, the portal may appear slightly different, but it should look very similar to this. Next. So please keep in mind our eligibility requirements for this award. You must have had your doctoral degree conferred between January 1st, 2015 and December 31st, 2020. And so the January 1st, 2015 represents the extension of the window that we are providing this year for applicants whose research has been affected by COVID. Having your degree conferred means having the degree issued by the university and that you have it in hand. Applicants who graduated in 2021 will have to wait until next year to apply, and there are no exceptions to this policy. Next year, we're going to plan to return to the normal 5-year window, so that will be January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2021. This is for the 2022 application. There are no residency restrictions for this award. You do not have to live in the United States, you do not have to work at a US institution or have earned your degree in the United States, nor are you required to have formal institutional affiliation. Independent researchers may apply for the postdoctoral fellowship. If relevant, IRB approval is required of fellowship applications, but you do not have to submit that documentation with your application. Should you be selected as a fellow, we acquire that information at a later date. And finally, concurrent funding is not permitted. If you're awarded funding for the project as well as for another source, such as the Ford Foundation or IES, you must select only one source of funding for your project. Right, next. If you're experiencing any difficulties with the online application or something doesn't look right with the portal, please notify NAEd staff so we can assist you. It's very important that you make sure you're applying for the correct program. The name of the application is Postdoctoral Fellowship. If you are a previous applicant, you need to make sure that you start a new application and not try and resubmit a previous one, as these will not be assessed. Reapplicants will need to provide a summary of previous applications. You can contact us if you need any materials from a previous application. The application due date is November 17th, 2021, and the submission, including your references, must be complete by 5 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a hard date and time. No submissions will be accepted after the deadline, and we will not be able to make any edits or additions to your application after the deadline. I just want to add briefly about the references. So this is a little bit different than many of your other references that you may have had for grad school or for the job market, where your reference writers can submit their letters of recommendation after the application window closes. That is not the case for this fellowship. They do have the same deadline that you do. Next. A few more notes on the application portal. Please complete all required fields to submit your application. We also ask that you upload all documents in PDF form and make sure the PDF is not locked. This not only minimizes errors and difficulties for us down the road, but also streamlines your application review. And I'm going to talk about this again, but it's very important, and we highly suggest that you talk to your reference writers well in advance of preparing an application. You want to give them plenty of time to write a strong letter of recommendation, as the selection committee reviews these submissions carefully. Remember that they have the same deadline that you do. The application portal will send an automated email when you input the names of your references with instructions and a link to upload their letters. Throughout the selection process, we will provide written updates via email. So it's very important that all email addresses you input are correct. Next. Finally, to close out the overview of the application, there are 2 last notes. Once again, all application components, including the letters of recommendation, are due on November 17th, 2021 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we suggest submitting your application well ahead of the deadline. The application portal sees a lot of traffic the date of the deadline, and if your application is received after the deadline, it will not be considered. Additionally, since we are a small staff, we typically have a difficult time trying to keep up with all the applicants and recommendation writers who try contacting us on the due date. Please plan accordingly and have any questions addressed before the application deadline. With the application overview completed, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Figlio, who's going to talk a little bit more about your written narrative and your audience.
Hi, everyone. My name's David Figlio. I'm the Dean of the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University, and my pronouns are he, him, his. It's nice to meet you. I'm going to share a few key pieces of information for you now, and we look forward to answering your Q&A. So, as you're thinking about this proposal, it's important for you to think about who your audience is. And so the audience are academics who are doing research on education. There are people who have their PhDs in education. There are people who have their PhDs in a wide range of social science disciplines, for example, who are doing research related to education. We endeavor to have considerable diversity represented on the selection committee in every sense of the word. We have people at a variety of career stages, racial and ethnic and socioeconomic diversity, a wide range of disciplines, methodological approaches, analytic approaches are represented. And while we can't have every possible substantive area and methodological and analytic and disciplinary approach represented, I've been impressed by the broad diversity of the selection committee. In addition, what's going to happen is we'll have selection committee members. We're endeavor to have selection committee members reviewing your proposal. And we try our hardest to have good matches between the selection committee members and the proposal themselves. There'll also be external readers, 2 of them for each proposal, and these are also closer to your area of work, but again, not necessarily in the applicant's field. I think I should mention now a couple of things that aren't on the slide that I think are relevant to know about with regard to the selection committee. If there's a conflict of interest, rather, between you and a selection committee member, it's completely fine for you to submit a proposal. Your proposal is welcome. That selection committee member just won't be involved in the review of your proposal or in the deliberations regarding the proposal. So it could be a colleague from your institution. It could be one of your mentors or a co-author. All of those people have have conflicts of interest and can't review your proposal or participate in deliberations. However, you don't need to worry that you'll be disqualified because, for example, you have somebody who is in one of those categories who's on the selection committee. And we asked selection committee members to identify all of the applicants who are, identify the applicants with whom they have a conflict of interest. So that's all taken care of. It is important to know that if you do happen to know a member of the selection committee, we don't want to give unfair advantage to people who have that knowledge of a member of the selection committee. So I and other members of the selection committee are not going to be able to coach you on how you write your proposal, for example. Please don't, if you do know that somebody's on the selection committee, a colleague, a mentor, a co-author, please don't ask them to read your proposal, give you feedback, and that type of thing. Selection committee members are allowed to be to write letters of recommendation for you. However, they're not allowed to give you advice or feedback that might give you an unfair advantage in the process. So let's move to the next slide. So given that that's your audience, what does your audience need to know? Okay, well, we're going to be expecting that you will locate yourself in a field of study. Remember that you're joining a conversation. You're standing on the shoulders of those who've come before you, and you're influencing the work of people who are going to come after you. So, a common mistake that people make is either ignoring the history of relevant ideas of work, or alternatively, trashing the history of relevant ideas and work. It's extraordinarily rare that somebody comes up with an idea that totally revolutionizes an entire field, right? And we're not expecting that. But what we are expecting is that you're going to make an important and consequential contribution, and the results are, and we like the idea that your results might be useful or relevant to policymakers or practitioners. So it's important for you as you write your proposal to share how this is building upon the conversation, how this is building upon knowledge, and how your potential contribution is going to make a difference. Okay, both scholarly as well as, if appropriate, in terms of policy and practice. Again, basic science is extremely valuable, right? And so even if there's not a direct relevance for policy and practice, that's not disqualifying either. But it's useful for you to describe the myriad ways in which your work could make a difference. We read the proposals very carefully, and I can tell you that we're going to be doing it over our holiday breaks. So please recognize that you have a set of volunteers who are giving up their holidays in order to advance the field. So we read the letters of recommendation, your career goals and personal statement, your application. All of those things play a role in communicating this information. So please pay a lot of attention to that. Next slide, please. All right. So what does your audience need to know? With regard to the importance of the topic, you are speaking to a multidisciplinary group. Both your primary reviewers as well as the broad set of scholars on the selection committee are sometimes direct experts in the area that you're contributing to, and sometimes not. You want to build an argument about your proposed work. Well, now you want to make sure that you are describing your work to a set of knowledgeable scholars who are not necessarily expert in the precise area that you're working on. Please avoid jargon and define your terms carefully, and be clear about what the specific questions are on the research project, and make sure you choose research questions that push the field. If we have to hunt to figure out what your research questions are, or if we have to divine what they are, that's not a good sign, because that suggests that we're trying to put words in your mouth. And in general, we want to make sure the most successful proposals are the ones that are very clear, describing exactly what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, and what the consequences of that are. As far as your methodology, what are you doing? Explain what you're doing. Why is it appropriate to the research questions? What are the limitations of this approach? This is also a mistake that people often make. There is no research question, no research project that's going to be totally definitive. And every research project has its shortcomings. My colleagues and I really appreciate people's intellectual honesty about the shortcomings. What do you think you're able to say? And what won't you be able to say? For example, what kinds of causal claims are you going to be able to make? And what are you not going to be able to make? Own that. Are the methods practical, given the time, resources, and other considerations? Are you going to be bending the space-time continuum in order to carry out this research during the time constraints of the project? We pay attention to that because sometimes, again, there are many more really exceptional projects than can be funded. That's a great position to be in. But then if you want to be on the funded side of that equation, it's important that you're realistic about what you can do and what you can't do. When you're doing the analyses, we want you to be very clear about how your analyses are going to address your study questions and to be very clear about the type of analysis you'll do. For example, what is the unit of analysis? Why? And as I mentioned under methodology, your timeline is very important. Is the fellowship period going to permit you to have a clear and realistic timeline for getting the study completed? Next slide. We want you to use your space appropriately. It's very common for people to not use the full amount of space that they have allowed them. That's a mistake because it's very rare that you can actually be very clear about all the things I was just describing on those prior slides and still leave a lot of extra space on the table. But now, how about an appendix going above and beyond the space that's allocated? The selection committee is not required to read appendices. So we want you to make sure that your narrative includes all the critical information. Assume that an appendix is there to provide maybe additional color, maybe more definitions or something of that nature, but it shouldn't be the only place in your proposal that where there's crucial information that's being described. Every single thing in the appendix ought to be elaborating something that's already discussed adequately and appropriately in the body of the application itself. So, and don't say something along the lines of, if you're going to conduct a survey, for example, say, I'll do a survey, questions are described in the appendix. That won't fly. That's not elaborative. Instead, if you're going to be, say, conducting a survey, you'll want to make sure that all of the crucial questions are at least mentioned in the body of the application, but then you could have perhaps some sample items instead being part of the appendix. Use that same type of logic for whatever other types of elaboration you want to have. Well, Maria and Angie and I wanted to go through this part of the presentation quickly to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. So with that, I think we'll close the slide deck and get right into answering questions. But before we do that, yes, for more information, please go start an application with www.naeducation.org. And for questions, I encourage you to send an email to info@naeducation.org. And the National Academy team members will answer the questions they can and refer you to other people or get additional information. Again, don't wait till the last moment to ask the questions, because National Academy of Education is a very small operation, and there are a lot of people who are filling this out. There are 171 participants on this webinar right now, and that should give you an indication of the degree of interest in this program. So if you do have questions, we encourage you to ask them well in advance of the deadline. All right, with that, let's go to Q&A.
Hey, thank you so much, David, for all your really helpful tips and perspective. We will go ahead and start diving in here till we get a lot of questions while we are presenting, which is great. And we definitely won't be able to get to everybody's question, unfortunately, or if your question is pretty specific to your situation, we're going to recommend that we talk to you offline. But if we don't get to your question, definitely email us and we will be happy to talk with you. I did see a few come in about eligibility for someone who receives their PhD in 2021. So just to clarify, you become eligible to apply the calendar year after your degree is conferred. So if you receive your PhD in 21, you become eligible to apply for the first time in 22. Someone asked why that is. Why do we have that year gap? And the reason for this is because the requirement of the fellowship is that you're taking a full year of leave from teaching and administrative duties. And we found historically it's been a lot easier for fellows to make that happen when they've settled into an institution and they're more likely to apply when they know where they will be the next year, rather than if they're just graduating and unsure what their situation will be the year that they carry out the fellowship. So that is the reason for that year gap. David, I see a question here that I think would be good to get your perspective on, which is there a preference that the proposed research project be part of an established research agenda, or could an applicant propose a research project that would start a new line of inquiry?
So we really like both of those types of research projects. By the way, is there a way to would it be desirable for us to be able to have us both showing at this juncture, or is it or should we keep the slide up with the questions and just the video?
Oh yeah, sure. I can turn that off so we can see each other better. There we go.
All right. So thank you. As far as as far as this particular question, if you are proposing a project that is a continuation of a research agenda, we want to successful proposals tend to be those where it's clear that what you're proposing is a substantial step forward. So for example, if this is study 5 in a research agenda and it seems like it's a relatively minor step forward, that's probably going to not be especially compelling to the selection committee. However, we like the idea. We want to encourage. I mean, I can tell you, I'll take my selection committee member's hat off and put on my dean's hat for a second. When deans are evaluating scholars for promotion and tenure, we want to see that you have made a major contribution in a given field and have a coherent research agenda. We in the National Academy of Education and the selection committee don't want to derail you from making a major and important, continuing to make a major and important contribution in a given research agenda and field. So just make sure it's a major and important contribution. Now, if you are entering a brand new research agenda, the selection committee is especially attracted to research proposals that are brand new if it looks like if you demonstrate evidence that you actually are going to be able to pull this off in the time necessary. So if you want to do an entirely new methodology that you've had no experience with before, or if you want to work on an entirely different research area that's orthogonal to the research areas that you've participated in before, I think it's incumbent upon you to dedicate some real estate in your proposal to helping to demonstrate, to helping to make the case that you're prepared to do that. That's also something that perhaps your letter writers, your recommenders can speak to as well. So that's my piece of advice for each of those two different types of things. The answer, we love both of those. The answer in each case is that you have a responsibility to you have a different responsibility to make a compelling case, depending on which of those two cases you're making.
Great, thank you.
I have a couple of questions about institutional affiliation that I'm just going to combine and answer. So whether you can be a visiting professor, whether you need to be affiliated with university, and whether if you having held a current postdoc means you can apply. So we do not have a preference for fellows who are faculty members at universities. It is true that the majority of past awardees have had faculty appointments, but we have had quite a few who have not. We have had independent scholars. We have had fellows who are working at for-profit businesses, and so there is history of being successful for that. So please don't let your affiliation or lack of affiliation stop you from applying.
We also have some questions about how the leave works. So you have some flexibility in how you carry out the leave, but the bottom line is you need to be taking the equivalent of 1 academic year of full-time leave from teaching and administrative duties so that you can spend 2 semesters fully focused on your project, 100% of your time focused on your Spencer project. So many of our fellows will put those 2 semesters back to back. So for example, those applying this year, many of them will take the full 22 through 23 academic year off so that they have 2 consecutive semesters of time to focus on their project. This is ideal. This is what we recommend if possible, because you are not then being interrupted by a semester on, semester off. You can fully dedicate your time to the project. But of course, we understand that's not always possible to do. And so you have some flexibility. If you want to, you could do 1 semester of 1 year full-time leave and then 1 semester of the next year full-time leave. Or you could do part-time leave, which is sort of what we'd like to say is the last resort, because we don't think it's an ideal situation. But we'd, of course, rather you be able to take the fellowship than have to decline it. So in that case, you would do 4 semesters across 2 years of part-time leave to focus 50% of your time on the project. Someone did ask, can I be working on another? Oh, sorry, David, go ahead.
Maria, let me add something to that because I think this is super important. So depending on the nature of the research project you want to have, it may be the case that that data collection it will happen at predictable and defined times, and there may be a period of time in which the project won't necessarily be dormant. And so it's important that you know that when I agree with every word Maria said, in terms of that there's a preference for projects where you take a full are able to take a full year academic year. However, we want, again, don't let that work, that it will not disadvantage you in the selection process if it's actually better for your project to have a gap in time between the times. We want you to propose the project timetable that makes sense given the nature of your project. And it may be, for example, that fall 22 and ring 24 is the appropriate times to take the leave. And if that's the appropriate time because of the nature of the research project, then propose appropriately and know that won't disadvantage you.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And I think also, if your professional or personal situation means you need to spread out your time. So if you'll be taking maternity leave, or your institution needs you to be teaching in the fall, and so you have to spread it out over 2 years, that also is completely understandable, and you won't be disadvantaged. And you can also change your timeline. I think a lot of fellows end up doing that because you're applying well over a year before you start. So if you propose one thing and change it when you're selected, that's totally fine. A sort of a related question is, if you are doing the full-time 1-year option, can you be conducting other research at the same time? So we really do ask you to dedicate 100% of your time to the Spencer project, because we are, the intention is to buy out your time so you can do that. Of course, the summer, you're welcome to work on other projects. And, we're not going to police you if you have a couple other things going on at the same time, but I think really the purpose of this is to give you sort of an unusual amount of time to focus on one project. And so we ask that you do take advantage of that.
So we had a question about somebody who had applied for a Spencer small grant, and they're waiting a response, and whether you can apply for the postdoctoral fellowship. So it's true that you can't hold Spencer funding and this fellowship at the same time. But you can apply for both, and then if you are selected for both, then you'll have to make the choice then about which you will accept. But I strongly encourage you to go ahead and submit an application.
Someone asked about, I'm a current postdoc at one institution, but I know that I'll be starting a faculty position at a second institution, and that's where I would be carrying out the fellowship. So do I apply through my current institution or through the new institution? So this is very common and not a problem. And there's not really a component to the application where you need to prove that your institution is supporting you to accept the fellowship. We do ask you, have you spoken with your department head? Have you spoken with your dean? But the institution doesn't provide a letter of support or anything like that. Of course, we encourage you to speak with them to ensure that this is something that you could indeed do. But if you're ultimately chosen as a fellow, we provide you with resources to help you negotiate with your institution. Unfortunately, sometimes the situations are difficult. It takes some time to figure out what the institution will approve and what they won't. But we have resources and are willing to help you in any way that we can if you get to the point where you've been selected and are having a hard time figuring out that situation with your institution. I don't know, David, if you want to add anything else from your perspective.
Look, I mean, I think in general, almost all institutions are thrilled when they have a faculty member or an employee who wins one of these postdocs. It reflects very positively on the institution, and my experience is that institutions try their hardest to make it work. In the 2 years I've served on the selection committee before, I think I only know of one case in which I think it was only one case in which a postdoctoral fellowship was awarded, but the recipient's institution didn't permit them to do it. And I think actually they reapplied the next year, the second year saying my institution's reconsidered. For example, if I have my memory correct. So I wouldn't sweat this too much.
I've had a question that was, somebody's asking about the professional development opportunities available within the fellowship year. I'm happy to speak about this. I help plan our 2 fellowship retreats. One occurs in November. Actually, you'll have 3 retreats. So you'll have 2 November retreats and 1 spring retreat. And what happens at these is that you meet with other members of your cohort, you receive mentoring opportunities from scholars in your field, usually NAEd members or former fellows, and you end up in several, like at your third retreat, you'll be on a panel where you present the results of your fellowship work, and you'll have other opportunities like this year at this fall retreat, we're having a panel that's in celebration of Ed Gordon, and then one on research in light of COVID-19. So the funds for that, by the way, are not taken out of your stipend. We fund that yourself, so you don't need to budget travel or hotels to the retreats into your stipend budget.
David, here's a question for you about how the selection committee balances quantitative and qualitative work when making decisions, and if they tend to favor one over the other.
So the selection committee really likes high quality research. I've found that the processes that the selection committee follows. And here, I mean, I'll give a shout out to Angie and Maria for this, because Angie and Maria are really great at collecting data, and at various points throughout the deliberation stage, we stop and say, okay, let's pause for a moment and let's take a look at whether a variety of methodologies are being represented, whether a variety of disciplines are being represented, whether we're having appropriate representation and coverage across various demographic characteristics, whether it seems like there's a skewness in terms of people coming from the most elite universities versus other universities, et cetera. So the answer, that's a longer answer to your question, which is to say that we absolutely do not have a preference for quantitative versus qualitative. I'm a quantitative scholar. My discipline is economics. I would say that in the past, I've been a very vocal advocate for qualitative research and mixed methods research on the committee. I've been a very vocal advocate for scholars far outside of my discipline, and I found that that's been the case for other committee members as well. So I think that if you have something important to share, we hope you'll apply.
Thank you. We had several questions about how the funding can be used and how that works with the buyout. So if your salary is under the $70,000 stipend amount, then you can use the remaining amount towards research expenses. People were asking about research assistance, perfectly fine. But say we're very flexible in how you use the money, as long as you can show us that it's being used to support your Spencer project, then it's generally fine. The one item that is not allowed are indirect costs, so just keep that in mind. And then someone asked, if my salary is above the 70, how does that work? In that case, we hope and encourage and expect your institution to top you up so that you're not taking a salary cut during this time. I will say most institutions do that for their faculty, but that is something that comes into play during that negotiation process. And when we provide you resources for how to handle those conversations, there's some suggestions for how you talk through that component with your administration.
A related question was whether fellows could use existing funds to support the project in terms of startup funds. And yes, those are, unless they're coming from a grant, startup funds and research funds from your university are generally fine.
David, I have a question for you. Is there a preference for any particular stage of research? For instance, research where data has not yet been collected, is already in progress, or where data collection has concluded? And how are they reviewed differently?
So the two most important things, to keep in mind are, is there ample evidence that you'll be able to complete the work in the specified timetable? And is there is there sufficient evidence that that this is actually something that you'll be able to do? Well, actually, I suppose those two things are the same, right? Because if you're thinking prospectively, but you have a very strong data collection plan, for example, and you'll be able to do the data collection and analysis in the time period that you're specifying, that's completely fine. Frequently, people have carried out research using data that quantitative or qualitative data that have already been collected or are secondary, and that's fine as well. If you have, we found that if you aren't currently working with, if you're not currently working with data, for example, secondary data, it's competitive projects usually are those that provide evidence that they will have access to those data, be it from a state or a school district or another type of data source. And so I think what we really care mostly about is there enough evidence that this project will be important? And is there enough evidence that you'll actually be able to carry it out? And beyond that, we love, now look, here's one thing I will mention. Suppose that the project is basically all the research is already done and you want funds for write-up or something like that. Those projects are generally not highly competitive, right? Because again, this idea behind this is to give you the gift of time as kind of like an accelerator, right? And so that's exactly like what Angie and Maria were talking about earlier. If it seems like the value add to your career is not extremely strong from this project, then even if we really, 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 really love the project, we're probably not going to choose your proposal over others where the value add might be more. So if it's, so I think in general, there should be meaningful conduct of the research, be it data collection or analysis taking place during your postdoc year. Angie, Maria, do you agree with that statement as well?
Great. We had another question about mentoring, which I'm also happy to answer. They're asking if there's a designated mentor matched to fellows within the broad range of scholars at NAEd. So we actually have a new mentorship program where you're going to receive a long-term mentor. You will meet with this person first at the fall retreat, and then you'll meet with them 2 other times throughout the year. One would hopefully be in person at the subsequent spring retreat, and then a virtual meeting through the summer. And so it's designed to give you, instead of simply feedback on just your research, but is intended to create a longer career mentorship relationship, which will be a year long. It may extend for more than a year if you two find it mutually agreeable. And then at the retreats, the mentorship there, the first and most important one is usually focused on your actual research. And then we are implementing a new project where you'll be able to have a more informal conversation with a scholar who will already be at the retreat.
We've had a couple people ask about how many applications we typically receive. It's usually somewhere between 220 and 240. And then at the first selection committee meeting, the committee members decide on the semifinalists. That's usually a group of 60. And then you're notified at that point. So this is in March. You'll be notified whether or not you've been chosen as a semifinalist. And then in May, you'll find out if you've been chosen as a fellow, and we choose 25 each year. Something we started doing this past year is sharing feedback with all applicants. So you will receive the comments from the reviewers, which have been edited down by staff to remove anything that's identifying of the reviewers, as well as any information that's not helpful to you as an applicant. And that we hope will be helpful in future submissions. So please note that you will get those after you apply, even if you are not selected.
So we have a question here that I'm delighted to be able to answer. There are efforts to diversify the fellows in terms of types of institutions or organizations represented. This is a really high priority for our fellowship programs, is increasing the diversity of our fellows in terms of demographics, but then also regional and institutional diversity. So I do want to say, if you're at an institution that you feel like is not typically represented, or you're part of the country or world where you do not see a lot of current fellows, we do strongly encourage you to apply. The committee looks very carefully at applications that are going to help increase the diversity of our fellowship program. Yes.
If I can add one more thing to what Angie's saying, you should know too that we have several members of the committee who have specific expertise on these types of processes, and so we've been making. This committee, for example, has been making process changes with this specific objective in mind. So, and we found that actually the process changes are in direct service of this. We want to make sure that excellent and promising research is being foregrounded and supported.
And David, I have another question that I think you could answer. And someone's asking if you could talk about common errors made in some of the things like the personal statement, and what are some memorable uses of the personal statement?
Okay, so I think that the places where I see common errors are less in the personal statement and more in the application itself. So the biggest common errors in the application itself are either you don't use your space, so you leave a lot of space on the table, or alternatively, likewise, we want people to spend time describing the literature, but sometimes people spend half the proposal describing the literature, and then they have to race to get through others, or they don't clearly describe their research questions, that type of thing. So the biggest places where I'd say there are common errors are not in the personal statement. What are some memorable uses of the personal statement? Well, we really do like, as I mentioned, we're really interested in trying to use this fellowship as an accelerator. And so if there are ways in which you can use your personal statement to describe the ways in which having this gift of time can be enormously valuable to you, that's something that I found is especially useful. In general, what happens is that there are three kinds of really field-changing research projects in my experience. There are times in which somebody has extraordinary and almost unprecedented brilliance. There are times in which people have excellent access to data, maybe because of special relationships trust relationships they built with data providers or research sites, et cetera. And there are places in which people have special insights that happen because of their circumstances and their experiences. I hate to break it to you, but probably there's nobody on this call who fits door number one, myself included, right? I mean, there's a ton of incredibly bright and brilliant and smart people out there, but very rarely there's a scholar who just is orders of magnitude more insightful and brilliant than everybody else. I can't say that I encounter these people, even though I encounter people who sometimes think they are. But those other two are places that often are really important, right? So you probably have something valuable to say if there's some special insight that you have because of circumstances or experiences or other types of things you've done. And you probably have something important and insightful to say if you have some relationships that are going to permit you to carry out some research that maybe other people would have a harder time doing. Your personal statement's a great opportunity to highlight some of those things. If you really think you're 10 orders of magnitude more brilliant than everybody else, I guess you can say that too. But I have a news flash for you. You probably aren't.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, David, is we had a couple of people who they're independent scholars or people working in non-academic positions who are wondering what advice you would give them of things to be sure to include in their application, or how to talk about their work, I would say generally.
Sure. Well, I think, okay, so one thing that's really important is we kind of understand how academic institutions work in terms of, like, for example, are you really going to be able to do this to do this work full time, right? Are you going to be able to devote full-time effort to the work? Because, you know, again, the selection committee members are coming from institutions where we kind of understand the economics and the mechanics behind how buyouts work and that type of thing. If you're an independent scholar, or if you're a person working for an organization where that might not be clear, then I think it's imperative that you provide some space to demonstrate to the selection committee that you're actually going to be able to devote full-time effort to the research if the fellowship is awarded to you. I think that's the one area of distinction. Otherwise, great research is great research, regardless of what type of employer you have. And so I don't think that you have a special responsibility to describe your research any differently than you would if you were coming from a more traditional way of, or a place where most of the fellowships are given. You just need to make sure that you articulate how you're actually going to be able to carry out the work. Given, you know, is your time going to be protected, and how? Are you going to be expected to do other things? Is this really going to be the first thing you're thinking about, or is it going to be the residual claimant of your time? That's what we're going to be looking for. Do we have time for maybe one more quick question? I know I have a hard stop at 2 Central, which I'm going to blow, but I can't answer more than one more question.
Yep, no problem. So let's see. We had actually several international applicants asking whether it's a residential fellowship, do they need to be based in the United States? and absolutely, you do not need to be based in the United States. You do not need to be a US citizen. You will be traveling to the United States for the 3 retreats that Angie mentioned, but the travel costs of those trips will be covered by the NAEd and will not be taken out of your stipend. Okay, great. So we
really encourage international scholars to apply. I would say this is a conversation that we've had at length in each of the 2 years I've served on this committee in the past, is that we would love to have great applications from all over the world.
Great.
The question I want to answer very briefly, and somebody asked if their PhD needed to be in the field of education in order to be eligible to apply. That is not the case. We welcome applicants from across the field, as long as your project is related and your career is related to education, you are eligible.
Great. Well, we are at time. I want to thank David so much for joining us and for sharing his insights, and to encourage you to reach out to us via email if we didn't get a chance to answer your question. And we are so looking forward to receiving your applications by November 17th. Thank you, everybody.